Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Community Archives lecture, Partnerships. So we'll be looking at a few weekly topics for this week. What types of relationships can community archives have with mainstream archives? What are the possible advantages and disadvantages for communities entering these partnerships? And what factors can influence the development of these relationships? So we'll start by looking at some of the different types of partnerships that community archives and more mainstream archives can enter into. So this is something that the Stevens article talks about quite a bit. So we have consultancy, advice, curation / dissemination, custody, and also collection. And it's interesting to think about how each of these types of partnerships can result in advantages and also disadvantages for communities that are entering into these types of partnerships with traditional archives. So I have a diagram here showing, at least from my perspective, the possibility of negative consequences, or the possibility of a community being exploited by more traditional archives when these different types of partnerships are entered into. And so generally speaking, as you move from the inner circle here, where I have consultancy, towards a collection partnership, you're going to see the level of mediation by the mainstream archive increase. So there may be a small amount of consultancy or a small amount of mediation in a consultancy partnership, but if there is a collection partnership that is entered into, then there's more of an opportunity for mediation to take place. And I feel like the higher level of mediation a traditional archive has, the greater the possibility that the community entering into this partnership may be at greater risk of being exploited. It's not a guarantee, certainly, but there's more of a likelihood that this can occur. Anytime a traditional archive is having more of a role in determining how records created by a community are appraised and arranged and described and accessed and preserved, it can reduce the likelihood that the records will be understood in their original context, because it may be the context or the view of the traditional archives, who may have a small connection to the community represented in the records. And it may result in a relationship that doesn't necessarily centralize the community's well-being. So it may be that, especially as we get to partnerships like custody and collection, it may result in a partnership where the traditional archive may not have much regard for the community's well-being at all, because they are the ones that hold a great amount of power, especially within these two types of relationships. And thinking cynically, that can give them very little it can make them feel very little need or obligation to consider the community's well-being and translate that well-being into record-keeping decisions and practices. So you could argue that all of these partnerships have that potential for a relationship that is strictly extractive and doesn't really support the community's well-being and doesn't really represent the records as they were originally created and used by a community. But again, I feel as you sort of move outward and the level of mediation increases, that likelihood becomes more possible. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So we have our consultancy partnership here. So this is one where the community provides suggestions to a traditional archive about records that they might consider acquiring, provide advice about how records might be described, how records might be preserved, and so on. And so this is a pretty empowering relationship for the community archive. They have the power, or at least some power, to influence the actions and operations of the traditional archive. And I think there's correspondingly sort of less mediation by the traditional archive and less potential for an exploitative relationship or partnership being developed. So at least from my perspective, this is the only relationship within that the Stevens article mentions where the community archive is wielding most of the power. They're the ones choosing whether or not to provide advice. They're the ones that are making recommendations about how records might be managed. And that's a pretty empowering situation. So next we have advice. This is a partnership where the community archive still has a fair amount of autonomy, but more traditional archives give them advice about how to handle different record-keeping decisions that they may be faced with. So how to arrange and describe records, how to preserve records, how to provide access to records. So, I mean, this is still advice, so presumably the community archive could take it or leave it. But there is more of a mainstream traditional archival voice here. So it may be that the advice that traditional archivists are giving doesn't necessarily correspond with the context or cultural needs of the community that is housing the records. And we've talked in a few instances in this course about how traditional archival thought doesn't necessarily consider the fact that people represented within records should have a say in how records are managed. They may not consider certain records that the community creates to be records. And so it could be an instance where some of the advice that community archives are receiving, again, may not necessarily connect and correspond with their culture or the context of the community. Another type of relationship or partnership that the Stevens article mentions is curation/dissemination. So one in which traditional archives help mainstream archives disseminate information contained in the community archives. The article mentions how traditional archives may help community archives set up things like exhibits and perhaps provide suggestions about items that might be included in the exhibit. And so this might be one that also shifts a lot of power to traditional archives. If they're the ones that are suggesting which items go into an exhibit or how those items are represented to members of the general public, then unless it's done in collaboration with community members, it may result in records being put into an exhibit that the community may not necessarily want to share with the public, or exhibit text which doesn't reflect the complexity or cultural sensitivities of the community being represented within the exhibit. So the Stevens article mentions ruckus, which is also something that another one of our articles touches on, and how they had a strong say in what types of materials were included, but it does seem like there was some give and take there. And so there is a chance for the community to not be able to represent itself as fully or honestly or completely as it might wish to do. The next one that we'll look at is custody. So I feel here we're further getting into more territory where the possibility for exploitation becomes more possible, and the level of mediation can get quite pronounced. So this would be a situation where community records are actually housed within a more mainstream or traditional archive. And obviously this can place a lot of power in the hands of the mainstream archives. If they say, okay, we'll hold your stuff for you, or we'll provide a space for your stuff, then they may expect or want to have some power over what's included in those records, how those records are represented to the public, and so on. And that's something that is represented in the Sadler article this week about the Sheffield Council archives and the conflicts that they had with the people who are attempting to establish the Sheffield Feminist Archive. So, this can be a pretty equal relationship if there is genuine collaboration in what access looks like and exactly, how the records will be handled and who will be looking at them and so on. But, it's very possible that the traditional archives will say, okay, well, if we're going to hold your stuff, we're going to have power over record keeping decisions surrounding this archive. And again, you can see that represented in the Sadler article with some of the decisions that the Sheffield Council archives wanted to make, and we'll touch on those in just a minute. And then last, we have collection. So this is where the traditional mainstream archives are simply collecting records related to communities, and there may not be much, if any, relationship to the community at all. It may be that community members just simply want the records to survive in some form, and so they're willing to say, all right, if we don't do something, these records are going to be destroyed, so we would really like you to take them. And again, the community might not have any control over record-keeping decisions surrounding those records. And this can really result in an imbalance of power. And it may be a partnership in which the benefits to the community may be pretty insignificant. So there's a possibility of tokenization here, where the mainstream archives is just collecting things to fill gaps in their collections, and they don't really have the interests of the community in mind, and they may not be as interested or even capable of representing the records in their original context. So I feel like this is the type of partnership further out within the sort of spectrum of possible power imbalance and exploitation, and one that has the most likelihood for the community losing power and receiving the least amount of benefit for this type of partnership. So it's important to note that all of these relationships do have the potential to be fairly co-equal. Maybe not collection as much, but at least custody, dissemination, advice, and certainly consultancy. So if there is a genuine interest on the part of mainstream archives to have equal and mutually beneficial relationships, and that's certainly a possibility. But again, as you move out here, there is definitely more potential and room for exploitation to take place. It's also important to note that community records may move through these different stages or through these different types of partnership. So it may start out that the community archive has more of an advice relationship to a traditional archive, and then for whatever reason, they might end up having some kind of custody partnership. Or, it may move from the community archive getting advice from the mainstream archives to the community archives giving advice to the mainstream archives. So there can definitely be some movement along and through these different partnerships. So just to focus on some of the possible advantages and disadvantages that can result from these different partnerships, and attach them to levels of mediation, which we've talked about before, and also some of the principles for community-centric archiving. So looking at records in their original context and looking at the well-being of the community and community members as being a central consideration. So next we'll talk about some of the different considerations that may contribute to the possible formations of the different types of relationships that we've discussed. And a big one can be the goals of the community. So the wishes and aspirations of the community that may be transferring their records to an archive or collaborating with the traditional archive in one of the other ways that we've discussed. So as the Sadler article mentions, it may be the goal of the community and the goal of the community archivists to continue in activist struggles. And that may make traditional archives a little bit concerned, or it might give them pause, especially if it's a traditional archive that has to make some kind of political considerations about where it gets its resources from and how facilitating activist goals that might work against the interests of those who fund archives, how that might ultimately play out for the traditional archive. There might also be a wish to focus more on the day-to-day history of a community, and that might not be an interest for traditional archives. So just from an appraisal viewpoint, it may be that a traditional archives, for whatever reason, doesn't consider the records that a community archive or community archivists want to work on together in some form are important enough for the mainstream or traditional archives' attention and efforts. They need to be like, you know, we don't really see why you're keeping this stuff. We don't want to expend our resources in helping preserve this stuff. And, you know, that can certainly undermine or strongly influence the development of any relationships between a community archive and a traditional archive. It's also important to look at the desire of control that a community may want to have over records that may be in the custody of traditional archives, or, you know, maybe at the center of any of the type of partnerships that we've talked about. It may be that community members want to have a level of control or a level of participation in record-keeping choices that is broad and deep, but the archive may be unwilling or unable to provide it. And so this is something that, again, the Sheffield Feminist Archive article by Sadler touches on. The members of that community wanted to have a lot of control and a lot of participation in the shaping of that archive, you know, moving forward, but the Sheffield Council Archives was a little hesitant to make that happen. You know, they felt that some of the decisions that the community members were making weren't quote unquote archival, and that it, you know, was in the best interest of the records and researchers that certain record keeping processes be carried out in certain ways. So obviously that can create a lot of tension and these disagreements, and exactly how the records are going to be, you know, preserved and accessed long term can definitely shape what these partnerships and relationships look like, or if they take place at all. The Sadler article also touches on conflict over types of materials that would be collected. So not just the content, which we already touched on, but the format of records. As we've talked about in this course, mainstream archives can have a pretty set view about what type of record is archival and what isn't archival, and if the records that are important to a community or the records that sort of best represent how a community communicates within itself don't really meet that criteria, then that can certainly be a big topic of discussion, and it can be an issue that can really impact what these partnerships are going to look like. I think the nature and the sort of overall wishes or characteristics of a community archive can have a big influence as well. So looking at the Ruckus article, the archivists really desire for something that was flexible, loose, and creative, which they discuss on page 289. And they really had a lack of desire to be restricted to a professional frame of reference. They wanted something that was a little bit more irreverent, something that maybe matched the characteristics of the community that they were coming from a little bit better, and wasn't something that was kind of boring and staid and super professional. So the community members talk about on page 293, there's always a bit of mischievousness in us. Ruckus is the finger up at the same time as the embrace and the kiss. Love and lubrication is our sign off at the same time as fuck off, we'll do what we want. We're not far away from the punk generation of the 70s, so there's a kind of shiftiness and abrasiveness about the way that we are. So obviously, if that is sort of the mindset that a community embraces, and if that's sort of the characteristics of a community, then obviously those are the ones that should be tied into how the community is communicated to the public. So ideally, there isn't this sort of flattening or homogenizing process that is carried out when community members partner with traditional archives, and the representation of the community should be as authentic and accurate and truthful and representative as possible. And so if community members want to sort of characterize themselves or express themselves in ways that again might contrast with how traditional archives sort of carry out their processes, or how they typically represent themselves to stakeholders, to community members, then that can be a pretty big conflict. And it may be that the wishes of the community and how the community is represented just don't really jive with what the mainstream archives feels comfortable providing or comfortable helping provide. So that can be, again, a big source of tension that can impact what these relationships look like as well. The Apple article talks about a reluctance for community records to be absorbed into mainstream archival custody, a reluctance to believe that traditional archives are going to be willing to enter into a partnership if they aren't at some point planning on having complete control over the records. So some skepticism towards the intentions that mainstream archives may have in developing these partnerships, and that may lead a community archive or community members to not want to enter into these partnerships at all, or perhaps to enter into partnerships that give community members more autonomy and more control. And, you can certainly understand where that skepticism comes from. And especially for this author, to be told by a mainstream archivist that, I can't wait for you to die so that we're able to get a hold of these records and, essentially do what we want with them. Obviously that's not the kind of language that is going to facilitate a sort of long-term, trusting and comfortable relationship. And Apple also comments on just a disinterest from community members and how sometimes community records can just bring up pain and bring up difficult memories. And it may be the desire of the community members just to sort of, see the records destroyed, which is what the Apple article talks about how Lucky made a few attempts to destroy all the records related to his club, and talking with Apple about sort of the experiences of running the club, and his memories were just really painful because, a lot of the people that Lucky knew at the time that the club was operating had been victims of the AIDS epidemic. There was gentrification going on, and just viewing these records, Lucky talks about, this person is dead, this person is dead, this person is dead. Obviously, there probably isn't going to be a lot of interest in having these records sort of survive in any capacity, let alone be involved in a partnership with a mainstream or traditional archives, which is just going to make these painful memories and these sort of unpleasant experiences more broadly available for, even more people. So you can certainly understand why community members might be reluctant to enter into partnerships that facilitate that sort of increased representation of records, which again may be very difficult to sort of think about and dwell on too much. So at the end of the day, genuine partnerships between community archives and community members and mainstream archives require all parties to have a willingness to share power. And that's certainly not always true. And if there are any misgivings by community members and community archivists about what exactly this power sharing is going to look like, or if there are any misgivings from traditional archives about how potential power sharing is going to maybe interrupt the status quo within their institution, then that can shape the different types of partnerships that these different archives enter into, and that can have implications for record-keeping decisions surrounding the records further on down the line. So as I just hinted, the identity of the community can be a big factor. So if the community consists of community members who have a strong sense of identity, or as I mentioned, have maybe been, marginalized and symbolically annihilated in the past, then they might have a strong desire to maintain a high level of power and control over their records. One interesting thing that the Ruckus article notes was on page 288, they talk about how the Charity Commission in the UK had objections related to the use of the word queer, but there was a strong desire by the community to reappropriate that terminology and turn it from something sort of hateful and derogatory to a term that had positive connotations. So this was a part of the identity that the Ruckus founders felt was important, and that sort of shaped the relationship that they wanted to have with more mainstream and traditional archives. They also talk about how being Black was strongly influential in the relationship that they developed with archives, about how they felt that since the London Metropolitan Archives had other Black gay collections, that made them feel more comfortable into entering into a partnership with the London Metropolitan Archives. So just within the Ruckus article, that's a couple of examples of how the sense of identity impacted how the founders of Ruckus thought about different relationships with institutions outside of their community. On page 7 in the Sadler article, the author writes about how there was a desire to see a variety of feminist identities represented in archives, so not seeing just white feminists, but feminists of color as well, and about how that was something that influenced the Sheffield Feminist Archives' thoughts about creating a partnership and what kind of partnership they wanted to create. So identity is something that we've talked a lot about in this class, and it's something that can be, very multifaceted. But as with other aspects of community archive, it is one that can have a strong influence in how community archives operate, how they form. And in this instance, you can make the argument that they have at least some influence in determining what archives community archivists and community members may feel comfortable forming partnerships with, and exactly how much power they're willing to cede to traditional archives that they may be forming a partnership with for whatever reason. Another factor worth considering is the relationship that community members may have had with archives, or the perception of archives that community members have. The Sadler article talks a fair amount about how feminists in Sheffield had negative impressions of archives. They felt that archives were places where materials are locked up and rules are authoritarian. And that was really the opposite of what they wanted. They wanted to have an archive that was open and that was accessible to everyone. If you remember, the Selly article talked a lot about wanting to have an archive that was very open and very accessible to community members. So these, if you have a negative perception of an institution or a profession, that may make it less likely that you're willing to cede power to them, and that can certainly influence the type of partnership you feel comfortable entering into. The Stevens article on page 69 talks about how many community archives remain suspicious of the mainstream agenda and deeply committed to preserving their autonomy, about how this wariness is rooted in long and bitter experiences of exploitation and discrimination, and also an acute awareness of the ways in which colonial domination was enforced through the appropriation and accumulation of the material culture of subordinated people. So if you are a community that views archives as being, another toe in the foot that has been on your community's neck for who knows how many years, that might make you hesitant to enter into any kind of partnership with mainstream archives, especially a relationship that can involve you compromising your autonomy and ceding some power to traditional archivists. Another factor that can shape what relationships between mainstream and community archives looks like is how traditional archivists might view community archives and community archivists. And this is something that the Stevens article talks a fair amount about towards the end, where they discuss about how mainstream archives can sometimes view community archivists as usurpers or amateurs. Community archivists might feel some discomfort about ideas of sharing power. They may feel that they're the experts, they know the best, and there's an interesting section where Stevens quotes Katelar, who talks about this sort of reflective distaste for outsiders influencing archives as kind of like a psychotic shield, which is hopefully a little strong. But anytime that you are a member of a profession and you have people who may not have the training and skill and education that you have coming in and saying, well, I think that this is how things should be done, or you're doing this wrong and let's consider doing it this way, it's normal to feel a little bit of apprehension and a little bit of discomfort at that. And so that can cause you to view people who are saying that and making that argument with, again, a certain amount of distrust or condescension. And that can certainly influence the type of partnership that a traditional archives might want to have with the community archives. They may say, we're the experts, we're not really interested in your opinion, we're going to provide advice to you, we're going to make suggestions about how you can create exhibits. We feel like your materials are best served being in our custody, or we're just going to collect your stuff and, that's that. So it's kind of a two-way street. How community archives view traditional archives can perhaps influence them to want to enter into a certain type of partnership, and how traditional archives view community archives and community archivists may lead them to have a desire to enter into a relationship which might be the complete opposite. So community archives may feel like we don't want to cede any power or very little power, and traditional archives may feel like we're the experts. I have an MLIS, so you should really just leave everything to us, and we'll kind of let you have your say, but ultimately the decisions are going to be ours. So there can be some big conflicts there that can shape any kind of partnership that a community and a traditional archive might have. Another interesting factor is the content of records that might be found in communities, or the discomfort in the types of records that are created by communities or found in community archives. On page 293 in the Ruckus article, one of the founders talks about how a lot of the history of the gay Black community in the UK it's unpalatable. Discussing things like sex parties, violence, gay racism, exploitation by the white community, a lot of stuff that isn't very nice and doesn't sit easily in museums and community events, and stuff that doesn't sit well with their memories either. A history that is born from struggle, a history born from being refused entry to clubs, and so on. And I'm kind of paraphrasing the quote here, but it's a really powerful and interesting quote on page 293. So documenting a history that is abrasive and may have violence and sexual content might be something that traditional archives feel a little uncomfortable about. Just providing access to records that may have explicit descriptions of sexual activity or whatever else might be going on. But that's an important part of a community. That is stuff that documents the complexity and flux of the community, which, as we've discussed, is so important. So if you if you want to enter into a partnership that allows you to kind of whitewash that stuff or not really describe it or make it as accessible as it should be, then that can cause some problems and lead to a particular type of partnership being created, or possibly no partnership at all. Just to think of a local example, the Queer Zine Archive in Milwaukee, some of those zines are very sexually explicit. I haven't seen all of them, but the ones that I've seen, have pictures of penises and sexual activity and all kinds of things. And it's just hard for me to imagine a more traditional or mainstream archives really embracing the idea of providing access to those materials. Especially university archives or archives connected to some kind of public organization, there can be some controversy there. And later on in the course, we'll talk about controversial records that can be found in archives. And so we'll discuss this issue a little bit more, but it is something that can make traditional archives feel uncomfortable for sure. The last one that we'll mention is sustainability. Sustainability can be a strong driving force for community archives to engage in a type of relationship with a traditional archives in the first place. It may be a circumstance where community archives are just running out of resources. They don't have the resources they need to take care of their materials, and that compels them to enter into a partnership with mainstream archives in order to make sure that the records survive and are maintained. So you could make an argument that the more difficult the sustainability issues a community is facing are, the more likely they're going to engage in a relationship that is less equal. If you are coming to a mainstream archives with sort of your pockets turned out and saying, okay, well, we're really kind of on our last legs here, can you help us out? Then that leaves you less power to influence what a partnership is going to look like. Ideally, traditional archives aren't going to be that exploitative, and they may not necessarily be doing it intentionally, but it can certainly be a possibility that that is going to take place. So it seems to me that if community archives want to enter into a relationship which is more co-equal and is more respectful and more reflective of power sharing, then they should try and develop a relationship when they aren't sort of desperate for something that is going to save the records. So they don't want to be in any port in a storm situation, because that port may not be as beneficial to the community in the long run as it would be if the community archive was saying, well, we're doing fine, but we would like some advice about this, or we would like your thoughts about how we can handle this. When a situation can allow the community to preserve a lot of its power and continue to have an influence in record-keeping decisions surrounding records. In another instance, it may be that the community doesn't really have much say at all, because they're really asking the archives to come in and rescue their records for them. And we'll talk more about sustainability later on in this course, and there are some interesting thoughts about how sustainability should factor into some of the different partnerships that mainstream and community archives can have. But I'll tell you now, it is a strong factor that can facilitate a discussion about a potential partnership, and B, shape what the ultimate structure of that partnership will be. Okay, so that's it. So as I discussed today, some of these things that I talked about this week, we'll talk about more later on in the course. But this is one of the most interesting parts of this this course, in my opinion, because there can be so many interesting and strong factors that can cause community archives and mainstream archives to work together to complement each other. And a lot of those factors can also shape ultimately what that partnership looks like. And I hope if you are a, a mainstream archivist in the future and you are working with community members who do have a desire to enter into a partnership with your archive, then you are willing and able to advocate for the most equal partnership that you can, because the last thing that you want to do is to be an archive that intentionally or unintentionally ends up exploiting the people that are trying to be represented and that are possibly coming to your archive from a position of need, because that's likely what community members have been experiencing for who knows how long. And the last thing that you want to do is continue to exploit them and marginalize them by excluding them from record keeping decisions surrounding records that document their community and their history. So I hope that this lecture has given you some food for thought about how you might approach these partnerships in the future if you are ever faced with the possibility of influencing what some of these partnerships look like. So just something to keep in mind. This lecture is an interesting cross-section between things that we've already talked about and things that we'll talk about in the future. So it's a nice bridge to the past and also a nice segue into some of our discussions in the future. So thank you for listening, and as always, let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week and stay safe.